I'll just stand up here. You shorties can be down there. It'll be perfect.
Intro. It was the original plan to leave the rest of the house to Annie. However, I came back into town for her birthday and we decided, I think it was her idea, to
creep.
to dedicate a few more days to working on the tiny house and buttoning it up. That means you guys get a third video wrapping it up. Additional bonus, George Vondriska is here. As I learned on the first two parts, it is so much fun working with friends, so the more the merrier. Let's get our butts to work. Woo. I know you guys are watching this back to back, but it was actually 2 months in between the first time where the first 2 videos were made and this time. And in that time, Anne completely cleared out the job site by removing that old shed she knocked down prior to us starting on this one. She also leveled out the land and caulked and primed most of the tiny house. Building together again. This week we started off with electrical. First using a chalk line to mark the heights of the electrical boxes. While George started nailing on the boxes, I actually started screwing down the floor. Ann and I used nails putting it together, but adding screws will prevent squeaking over time. While we were keeping busy there, Ann was going around these studs, drilling holes in order to run the Romex. Ann figured out where she would be placing her panel, then we started routing the wire. And she actually plans to do solar in the future so that this will be completely off-grid. But while figuring out that process, we stuck with the traditional method of power. The tiny house will have a few boxes along the lower walls, a few light sconces above the windows, and then 6 outlets in the ceilings for lights and maybe even fans. Working as a team, George worked ahead and drilled the holes needed while I followed him running the actual wire. I'm not sure if you can see or not, but Ann placed a level across both of our ladders to hang the Romex wiring from. This way she could feed it to me as needed. And this is a great solution if you don't have a spool caddy. After getting all of the wall outlets and switches wired in, we ran the wiring to the ceiling lights, then started on insulation. We went with pre-cut and face bats and started on the ceiling as, of course, it's the worst. What we found to work quickest is George and I would be on the ladders with Ann passing us up the bats. I would feed in my end and staple it down, then pass the stapler to George where he would repeat on his end of the bat. All the while, Ann would be cutting another bat to size to fit the wall cavity my ladder was currently positioned in front of. And by the time I split the bat down the center, fed it behind the wiring in the cavity, George was done with his securing and would pass the stapler back to me. All 3 of us kind of got a kick out of trying to perfect the timing of this. When it came to the walls, it seemed to go even quicker, as most of the bays were as easy as taking a bat out and then stuffing it in the cavity. However, we were working with just a single stapler, so we ended up with 1 person stuffing, making sure to split the bat and place half behind the wiring, 1 person stapling, and then the 3rd person measuring the oddball size cavities and making those cuts needed. And this kept all 3 of us busy and knocked out the job very quickly. Oh, and guys, please excuse the low lighting this one. It was overcast a lot during the trip, and of course the tiny house does not have lights yet. Alright, next up was drywall, which I personally was excited for because I've never done drywall before. Well, we started with the ceiling because of course it's going to be the most difficult. Also, you want to do your ceiling first so that your wall boards could butt directly up to it. We first made a helper in the shape of a T, and this will be used to hold up the drywall sheet while we have time to secure it. Now folks, I know this to be called a dead man, but George knows it to be called an old lady, which are quite different. So leave me a comment and let me know what you know it as and where you're from, because I'm just a little curious here. Either way, you can see how it works here. George and I are able to lift the sheet into place. Then, when we're all happy with its position, Ann could kick in the dead man, which allowed us to rest our shoulders and start attaching. Now, before attaching the panel though, George would first cut out around the electrical boxes with the router and a bit called a roto-zip. This bit works similar to a flush trim bit, except it's much smaller and is actually designed for this specific application. Then using a collated gun, which is just a drill that feeds screws off a magazine, I would start attaching my side to the rafters. Since there is only 1 collated gun, George would use a regular drill to drive in screws on his side. At least enough to hold the panel up so that he could hop down, start lining out the next sheet, and I could finish up with the attaching. Alright, after getting the ceiling knocked out, we unloaded the rest of the drywall from the truck and into the tiny house so it would all be on hand to quickly throw up. The sheets came in a pack of 2, and just a tip, as you unload and stack them, peel off the paper ends and flip the outside panel so it faces the same direction as its partner. This way the entire stack is facing the same way in the end, and you won't have to do a bunch of flipping around once you're rocking. You ready to rock?
Sheetrock.
Sheetrock. With the ceiling done, we repeated the process and knocked out the walls. We very quickly got into the groove of 2 people holding the panel up while another attached. This was mostly my job because once I discovered that collated gun, I was not willing to give it up. It was quite fun.
Right behind you is the leader.
It's fun when it goes good.
Yeah. You'll notice that the drywall we are using is green, and that's because this is moisture and mold resistant drywall. And notice that it was only going to cost $60 more to use this kind of drywall over the traditional kind. And with it being in the forest and in Washington, she decided it was worth the cost. A few other things I learned that are helpful on this step is to mark all your studs and rafters on the panel before setting them into place. This way you can very quickly go through and attach it. Of course, staggering your seams just like you would with any other sheet application. When you start on the second row, use a full panel and start in the center of the room, then work your way out. Oh, and if you use a regular drill for drywall, look into a special bit for drywall screws that will prevent you from overdriving the screw into the drywall sheet. Now, we were in Washington and dancing around the rain the 3 days that we had to work. So with the break in the rain, we decided to pause on the inside and move up to attach the roof. You should remember from part 2 that Ann and I already progressed the roof to sheathing, roofing paper, and drip edge, but we're waiting on the metal roof to be delivered. So now it was really as simple as passing the panels up, laying them down, and attaching them. While these panels are large, they aren't that heavy, so I was able to tilt it up to the roof, then George was able to pull it up all of the way and create a stack for us to use. One panel actually was not long enough to have the overhang Ann was wanting, so we started off by cutting up a panel to create a starter strip. Starting at the bottom of the roof, we made a few spacers to make sure the overhang was even, then another spacer to use as a guide on where to place our screws. And this will keep these screw heads in line and looking really sharp in the end. After the starter row was complete, we started laying down the full panels, overlapping each one by 1 corrugation, and again using a spacer to make sure the overhang was even along the top of the roof. And this was my first time laying down a metal roof, and I must say I am a fan. It was easy and it looked very sharp afterwards. Also, total, I don't even know if the roof took us an hour to complete. Quickest roofing job I've ever done. What about you?
You bet.
Still taking advantage of the let up in rain, we continued with the outside work, moving over to the soffit. For this, we used some plywood that Ann had on hand, which just happened to be some 3/8 inch material. And honestly, this wasn't all that bad. You know, doing soffit on my shop was horrible, and I think it scarred me for life, or at least my shoulders. But using boards that were only 8 feet long made it extremely manageable. Tip for this step is to go through and mark all of your studs on the siding before throwing up the soffit. If you forget, it isn't a big deal as you can just measure, but it does speed things up if you remember and mark.
There it is.
It was in the middle of this step that George had to fly back to Wisconsin, so we said our goodbyes, but we got back to work. Since Ann and I were already on ladders, we went ahead and cut and threw up the remaining trim work needed. But after that, the only thing left to do outside was to prime and paint. And we decided to leave that and spend my remaining day and a half getting the inside further along. Now, Ann does plan to do a nice reclaimed barnwood floor eventually, but in the meantime, we did a second layer of plywood for the subfloor. Of course, we tracked in a lot of mud during the building, so we made sure to sweep before laying down these sheets, and also made sure to stagger the seams from the previous layer of treated plywood. Next, we threw up a few sheets of cement board, and this is because Ann is including a tiny stove in the tiny house. She will eventually plumb in an exhaust line that will vent through the ceiling, but for the meantime, we just took care of the floor and walls by cutting a few boards and attaching them in place. Of course, later Ann will cover up these boards in stone and create an accent section that should look pretty adorable and cozy. Even though it's far from ready to be installed, we at least wanted to unbox the tiny stove to set it in place and see how it would look.
There we go. cute right there.
Alrighty, now on to taping and bedding, which was, again, another first for me. And I will tell you now, I absolutely loved this step. I wish I had more time to dive into it and really get good at it. Anne taught me what she learned from doing her shop build, and then we took off on it. It took us a second to figure out the best way to work efficiently, but we eventually came to Anne going around and taping all of the seams, then me coming back and mudding. We used mesh tape for most of the seams, except for the corners, which we used paper tape on. And Anne was having a heck of a time with the corners, particularly in the ceiling, but a friend suggested wetting the tape before applying it, and Anne said that this made all of the difference in the world. So, just a tip if you're new to drywalling. We started the next morning off with a second coat, hoping that it would be dry by afternoon time so that we might be able to get a third coat on, but no such luck. With all of the rain Washington was having when I was there was just too much moisture in the air for it to dry that quickly. But no problem. I think that we got it to a very comfortable position for Anne to finish up. The entire build was awesome, but this last day was especially special. As it was Anne's birthday, we ended up eating birthday cake for breakfast. 2 different kinds, actually. Spent a few hours mudding together on this awesome little house we built together, then spent the rest of the time playing around her farm with her very lovable animals. And I just want to say that I feel extremely blessed to have found a friend who thinks that this makes up a perfect day. We got a lot done this week. We started off with wiring, insulation, drywall, soffit, trim, mudding and taping, taping and bedding. For real this time, I'm going back to Texas, and Anne will be finishing the rest of the tiny house build. So be sure to follow her, Anne of All Trades, on YouTube to see the rest of its progress. Not only is she going to do all of the sanding for the taping and mudding, but she's
Leave me with the best part, as usual.
I am a friend for a reason. But she also has a ton of plans for furnishing this. People are saying you guys built a shed. No. The difference between a shed and a tiny house is the inside furnishings, and believe me, this girl has plans. So stay tuned, and I hope that you all enjoy the series. Hey, perfect timing.
Yeah, you're such a good girl. She's like, where's the fire?
Yeah, so George said that the name of this is an old lady, and I'm saying it's a dead man.
Well, regardless, death is soon for either.